Today we are doing a guest curated walkthrough on Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman was enslaved, escaped, and helped others gain their freedom as a conductor of the Underground Railroad. She became an outspoken advocate for African American and women's rights, insisted that all be afforded dignity, treated with respect, and granted equality. Here to walk us through the exhibit and talk about this extraordinary woman is Mariana Brandman. Again, she is the 2020 to 2022 NWHM Predoctoral Fellow in Women's History. She is a PhD candidate in history at the University of Chicago. Her research interests include 20th century US history, women's and gender history, and race, sexuality, and popular culture. Her dissertation, Take Back the Mic, The Rise of Feminist Comic Performance in American Culture, traces the work of feminist stand-up comics from the beginnings of women's liberation movement into the 21st century. She received her BA in history from Yale University and her MA from the University of Chicago, where she has served as a preceptor and teaching assistant for numerous history courses. A dedicated public historian, she has worked as a researcher and archivist at the Chicago History Museum, the Newberry Library, the University of Chicago's Special Collections Research Center, the National Portrait Gallery, and the Library of Congress. We are absolutely thrilled that she is with us today to walk us through the exhibit. So please welcome Mariana Brandman. Mariana?
Hi, wonderful. Liz, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I'm really excited to be here today to go through the National Women's History Museum's exhibit on Harriet Tubman. So I did not personally curate this exhibit, but I'm going to go through it with you all today, and I'm going to be adding context and detail along the way to further illuminate the life of this extraordinary and remarkable person. I'll also show a few extra images along the way that are not included in the exhibit, but still I won't be able to get to everything. I've included a list of recommended resources that Liz will put in the chat box later, and that has resources for readers of all different ages, books, articles. So I encourage you to check that out afterwards and just learn even more, because there's just so much here to say. So to begin, I first want to draw your attention to the exhibit's opening quotation from Harriet Tubman. I find it's really emblematic of Tubman's courage, strength, and determination. So as it says here, there was, quote, "There was one of two things I had a right to, liberty or death. If I could not have one, I would have the other," end quote. So this leads right into, I want to mention some of the themes of this exhibit and Tubman's life story as I see it. So first, her tireless efforts. She just worked so hard on behalf of freedom for herself and her community, to which she was devoted. So not only were her escape and subsequent journeys back into Maryland dangerous and arduous, but she was always at work, raising money, cooking, cleaning, nursing, speaking, doing whatever she could to fight for freedom, for Union victory in the Civil War, for suffrage rights for all, and for the welfare of those around her. Second, there's the legend and myth-making that are just central to her story. So accounts vary widely about Tubman's exploits and the details of her life. Some of this is to be expected with 19th century history, with a subject who did not read or write herself, and particularly with a subject who is engaging in criminal activity and who was a fugitive herself for many years. You know, she wouldn't want to leave a paper trail. However, exaggeration is part of the story too, as it is with so many iconic leaders in history. Abolitionists who told her stories sometimes inflated the numbers of those she rescued or the methods she used on her missions. And so all told, it means that it can be difficult to pin down some of the facts, but there's also a lot to be learned from, you know, how she and others shaped her story over time. And one more note before really getting into it, I just want to make sure to say I'm going to be describing some instances of violence that Tubman and other enslaved people endured. So I just wanted to warn about that up front. As a conductor on the Underground Railroad, Harriet Tubman made several trips into slaveholding states, leading scores of enslaved people to freedom in the North. During the Civil War, she further risked her life and safety to work first as a nurse and then as a scout and spy for the Union Army. Afterward, she became an outspoken advocate for African Americans and women's rights, as well as a caretaker for the elderly in her community. Harriet Tubman was born Araminta Ross in Dorchester County, Maryland, likely in 1822, on a 1,000-acre plantation on the Blackwater River, which was owned by a man named Anthony Thompson. I'll get into more of her name later, but Harriet Tubman was her chosen name, so it's why we refer to her as such. So the daughter of Harriet Green and Benjamin Ross, Tubman was the fifth of 9 children and was known by the nickname Minty for Araminta. Today, no trace of Tubman's birthplace remains, but a historical marker notes the site. So here in this picture, we see, this is Cambridge, Maryland, which is in Dorchester County, where she was born. So in Maryland's Eastern Shore, this area, the lines between slavery and freedom were blurred, particularly compared to the image many hold today of slavery on cotton plantations in the Deep South. Maryland was a border state. Later during the Civil War, it did not succeed from the Union. And it was not unusual for families in this area to include both free and enslaved members. So white landowners, they owned enslaved persons, but they also hired free Black labor. And so the free laborers and the enslaved would sometimes work side by side. Now in 1840, Tubman's father was freed due to a stipulation in Thompson's will, but he continued to work for Thompson's family. And then Tubman's mother, along with Tubman and a few of her siblings, were also supposed to be freed based on a stipulation in a will by their owners, which were the Broaddus family, which were related by marriage to the Thompson family. But those owners in the Broaddus family ignored that law. Tubman, her siblings, her mother remained enslaved. So as a young child, Tubman was hired out to perform housework and childcare under a cruel mistress, where she received frequent beatings. In her teenage years, Tubman performed arduous manual labor in the fields, where she would chop wood, drive oxen, load carts, and plow the fields. Through this work, she developed the muscular build and the physical endurance that would become her trademarks, as well as her deep religious faith. The Bucktown Village store, pictured here, still stands as a historic site in Maryland. It was here that Tubman, likely around the age of 12 or 13, was shopping with the plantation cook when an overseer entered in pursuit of an escaped enslaved person. So the overseer ordered Tubman to tie the man up, and she refused to do it. As the escaping man bolted for the door, the overseer grabbed a 2-pound scale weight from the counter and threw it after him, but it did not hit him. It actually hit Tubman in the head. And so there is some debate as to how much it was it missed its mark or it was directed at Tubman. But it was a traumatic injury. It knocked her unconscious. She did eventually recover, but the injury had lasting effects for Tubman. She suffered from headaches and essentially narcoleptic seizures or sleeping spells for the rest of her life. So today we think it's some form of narcolepsy or epilepsy or both. And during these spells, Tubman also saw visions that she considered prophetic. She understood them as God spurring her to action. Okay, well, fortunately, we have to skip some. So decades later, Tubman married a free Black man named John Tubman, from whom she took her last name. At this time, she also changed her first name to Harriet, which was her mother's first name. And then in 1849, her owner suddenly died, and his family began selling off some of those they enslaved. Now, not wanting her family to be separated, Tubman became determined to escape. Her husband actually refused to go with her. He had steady work where he was, and he just didn't want to take his chances elsewhere. As a free Black person, if he was caught fleeing with a fugitive, he was liable to be sold back into slavery, to be simply shot dead, or even to be torn apart by bloodhounds who would be tracking them. So Tubman set out with two of her brothers. Now, on this attempt, her brothers actually forced them to turn back, but soon after, Tubman was still determined. She made her own way and escaped on her own via the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad, now this was a loose network with no central office or command structure. It was run by free and enslaved African Americans, also by white businessmen and housewives, sailors and captains, ministers and farmers, Quakers, Unitarians, Methodists, many others who believed that slavery was a terrible sin. So Tubman made it to from Maryland through Delaware all the way to Philadelphia. Now, at the time, Philadelphia was a city where there were people of both races who were seeking to overthrow slavery. And it was just also a place where African Americans had better opportunities for themselves and their children. When Tubman arrived in Philadelphia, she was assisted by the city's Vigilance Committee. And this is a committee that would help runaways. And she later made use of these contacts with the committee and other abolitionists in the city when she decided to embark on her rescue missions. So Tubman was free, but she couldn't be happy in freedom knowing that her relatives and friends remained enslaved. So she made the dangerous decision to return to Maryland to secure their freedom as well. She said, quote, "I had crossed the line. I was free, but there was no one to welcome me to the land of freedom. I was a stranger in a strange land, and my home, after all, was down in Maryland, because my father, my mother, my brothers and sisters and friends were there. I would make a home in the North and bring them there, God helping me," end quote. Now, Tubman knew she needed to prepare. She worked as a cook, a laundress, and a scrub woman in order to finance her first mission back into the South. In 1850, she got word that her niece and two of her niece's children were to be sold. And so Tubman was determined to get to them before that could happen. So with the assistance of her brother-in-law, Tubman was able to bring her niece and those two children back to safety in Philadelphia on her first expedition. But now, before I get into more details about those rescue missions, it's first important to understand the political climate in the turbulent years leading up to the Civil War. In 1850, Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act. This draconian new law allowed slave catchers to venture into free states to hunt down runaways, and it required citizens and police to deliver anyone suspected of being a runaway to federal commissioners. Now, these commissioners would hold the most perfunctory hearings before returning them to the South to a life of slavery. At these hearings, officials were paid $10 if they declared the person a fugitive, but only $5 if they did not. So I think that incentive speaks for itself. People who dared to protect the escapees could be fined $1,000 and sentenced to 6 months in prison. The Fugitive Slave Act really radicalized the North. They understood it as a violation of their sovereignty as free states. Now, for Tubman, the question was not whether she would violate the law, but how. She told her biographer later, quote, "I wouldn't trust Uncle Sam with my people no longer. I brought them all clear off to Canada," end quote. England had abolished slavery in its colonies about 2 decades earlier. And so Harriet started taking people up to Ontario, Canada. And in 1857, she actually moved there herself, established a base there in St. Catharines, Ontario. And then even after that, she ended up moving her base of operations to Auburn, New York at the very end of the 1850s. This because it was more conveniently located between Canada and Maryland for her frequent trips. And I'll tell you more about her time in Auburn at the end. So contrary to some narratives that are out there about Tubman's work, her missions did not extend throughout the South. She returned only to Maryland, specifically to the plantations on the Eastern Shore, which are near the Choptank River, which is pictured here, in order to bring away family members and friends whom she trusted. It was just too dangerous for her to go to places where she did not know the people or the landscape. And on Christmas Day, 1854, Tubman led her 3 brothers to freedom, traveling through Delaware, through Pennsylvania, and all the way through upstate New York to St. Catharines, Ontario, Canada. Now, the forests, marshes, and waterways of the Eastern Shore, pictured here, are largely unchanged since Tubman's time. Knowledge of the terrain was vital to survival while hiding and trying to flee. Tubman and the others had to successfully navigate the land and waterways, trap and forage for food, and hide from their pursuers. Tubman carefully planned these trips, but they do largely remain shrouded in mystery because of the secret and clandestine nature of the Underground Railroad. Now, some reports say she made as many as 19 trips and led as many as 300 people to freedom, but its more accurate accounts state that between 1850 and 1861, Tubman made 13 trips where she rescued about 70 people. And then she also gave instructions to about 70 more people who found their way to freedom on their own. So still just an overwhelming impact that she had. So there was also a common myth that Tubman had a bounty on her head for an amazing sum of $40,000. In reality, there was a reward offered for Tubman's return after her first escape attempt. It was up to $100, but there wasn't a staggering bounty like this. That number was actually made up in the 1860s by an abolitionist. And for some comparison's sake, that $40,000 figure, that's not far off from the bounty that was later offered for John Wilkes Booth after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. So you see how high that number is for the time. And there just isn't evidence that Tubman became so infamous among slave owners as to warrant a bounty on her head. It was probably not as likely that the slave owners in the area knew it was this one single figure who was leading all of these enslaved people to freedom. But also, it wasn't long before she was known among abolitionists and other conductors on the railroad as Moses. And ever since, Tubman has commonly been referred to as the Moses of her people. The phrase was popularized in the title of an early biography of Tubman's, and it's really just used to convey the enormity of her efforts to lead fellow enslaved persons to freedom. So Tubman employed a variety of escape and evasion methods to aid her missions. Disguise was a favorite. For example, if it was announced that a group of enslaved men had left a plantation, she would dress the fugitives as women for the trip north. An activist in the Freedmen's Aid Society wrote of Tubman, quote, "She has needed disguises so often that she seems to have command over her face and can banish all expression from her features and look so stupid that nobody would suspect her of knowing enough to be dangerous, but her eye flashes with intelligence and power when she is roused," end quote. She devised clever strategies, such as operating in the winter when the nights were long and people stayed indoors. She would leave on a Saturday night to take advantage of Sunday as a day of rest, and more importantly, because runaway notices couldn't be put in the newspapers until Monday. She would head south if she encountered slave hunters who were only tracking northbound routes of travel. And she would carried a drug that could be used on babies if their crying might put the fugitives in danger. Tubman even carried a pistol for protection, but which she would use on her own passengers if they became too tired or decided to turn back, telling them, quote, "You'll be free or die." According to one story, she knocked out her own tooth with that pistol to stave off an infection that would have otherwise jeopardized the rescue mission. On one occasion, she overheard some men reading her wanted poster, and the poster stated that she was illiterate. So she promptly pulled out a book and feigned reading it. She recalls praying she had it right side up, but the ploy worked. And for one of her most brazen missions, she convinced one of the fugitives in her group, who was very light-skinned, to pose as a white master transporting a group of slaves further down the road. During this time, her reputation in the abolitionist community, of course, grew and grew. She became acquainted with movement leaders like Frederick Douglass and John Brown. Douglass said, quote, "Excepting John Brown, I know of no one who has willingly encountered more perils and hardships to serve our enslaved people than Harriet Tubman." And John Brown, he actually referred to Tubman as General Tubman. He conferred with her when planning his 1859 raid on Harper's Ferry. And he said of her, quote, that she was one of the bravest persons on the continent. Tubman later said of herself, quote, "I was the conductor of the Underground Railroad for 8 years, and I can say what most conductors can't say. I never ran my train off the track, and I never lost a passenger," end quote. So Tubman conducted her last rescue mission in November 1861 as the Civil War enveloped the nation. Through her work moving passengers along the Underground Railroad, Tubman had become very familiar with different towns and transportation routes in the South, and this information proved extremely valuable to Union commanders after the war began. Tubman joined a group of other abolitionists who headed south to assist the enslaved people who had escaped to safety behind Union lines. She spent 3 years in South Carolina working as a nurse and cook among the military camps there. During the latter months of the Civil War, Tubman worked in freedmen's hospitals in Virginia. But first, before that, she became a scout and spy for the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers. She worked with Major General David Hunter and Colonel James Montgomery, and she would go behind enemy lines to obtain and deliver intelligence. In her work, she oversaw 9 Black Scouts. They were riverboat pilots who knew every inch of the local waterways, and she trained them in methods of gathering intelligence. Historian H. Donald Winkler writes, quote, "Harriet and her 9-man spy team evolved into a kind of special forces operation for the Black regiments. Her team sneaked up and down rivers and into swamps and marshes to determine enemy positions, movements, and fortifications on the shoreline beyond the Union pickets," end quote. So Tubman and Colonel Montgomery, along with about 300 Black soldiers, were given the mission to destroy Confederate supply routes and find and disable mines that had been placed by rebels in the Kambahi River. Tubman knew that enslaved people had placed those mines, so she sailed up the river on a reconnaissance mission with her scouts and found the men who had placed those mines. She promised freedom to anyone who helped her locate them. Then, on the night of June 1st, 1863, Tubman and Montgomery sailed silently up the Kambahi River, and Tubman guided the ships past those mines. The Union troops set fire to bridges, plantations, rice mills, and storehouses. They seized cotton, corn, rice, potatoes, all sorts of supplies, all located by Tubman and her scouts. The raid was a huge military success that damaged food sources for the Confederacy and opened the river for Union boats that could now cut off further Confederate supply routes. And all through the night, while the damage was being done in this raid, the gunboats sounded their whistles, a signal to the enslaved to run to the river and the boats that were waiting for them there. More than 700 enslaved persons, men, women, and children, answered the call. Tubman said she had never seen anything like it. Quote, "They reminded me of the children of Israel coming out of Egypt." And this led to Montgomery getting between 1 and 200 new recruits for his regiment. A Boston newspaper called the Commonwealth reported on the Kambahi River raid and said, quote, "The gallant band of Black soldiers, under the guidance of a Black woman, dashed into the enemy's country, struck a bold and effective blow without losing a man or receiving a scratch. It was a glorious consummation," end quote. However, a month later, that same newspaper did also identify Harriet Tubman, so basically exposed her on the front page for her spy work, which was not great. So Tubman went down in history as the first woman to successfully plan and lead a military expedition during the Civil War. Now there is some dispute about if she technically led the raid, and given her particular role as a civilian attached to the military. But I can tell you one Union general reported at the time, quote, "This is the only military command in American history wherein a woman, Black or white, led the raid and under whose inspiration it was originated and conducted," end quote. Now, more than 150 years later, Tubman has been inducted into the Military Intelligence Corps Hall of Fame. And with that, I'm going to switch to a different image. So this picture was discovered actually after this exhibit debuted in 2016. And it's now part of the collection at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. It was taken in approximately 1868, when Tubman would have been about 46 years old. So I've just told you about the Kambahi River raid, but there's another reason the name might be familiar to you. In 1974, a group formed in Boston to address the needs of queer and trans Black women, groups that felt disenfranchised in other movements and by other activists at the time. Now, they took their name, the Kambahi River Collective, from a book their co-founder Barbara Smith owned, which detailed the historic raid and the role that Tubman played in leading it. And they were aware it was a military operation that freed hundreds of enslaved people, and they wanted to spotlight their connection to a historical tradition of Black female activism and leadership. In 1977, the group released the Kambahi River Collective Statement. Now, this statement is regarded as one of the infrastructural documents of contemporary Black feminism. It says, quote, "We believe that sexual politics under patriarchy is as pervasive in Black women's lives as are the politics of class and race." And also later, quote, "If Black women were free, it would mean that everyone else would have to be free, since our freedom would necessitate the destruction of all systems of oppression," end quote. So I draw attention to this because here we can trace a connection between Tubman's work and the feminist organizing of Black women a century later, as they continued in the effort to dismantle the intertwined systems of racism and patriarchy. So after the Civil War, Tubman retired to Auburn, New York, where she lived surrounded by family. She cared for her parents and other relatives and became a stalwart of the community. She raised money for freedmen's schools, collected clothing for destitute children, and aided the sick and disabled. She also lectured throughout the East and worked with Black women's groups and the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. Now, Tubman had been active in the suffrage movement, the women's suffrage movement, since 1860. And Tubman continued to appear at local and national suffrage conventions until the 1900s. Now it's important to understand the pre-Civil War alliance between white female abolitionists and Black activists largely splintered following the 15th Amendment in 1871, which granted, at least on paper, in theory, universal male suffrage. Black female reformers understood that in addition to their sex, their race significantly affected their rights and opportunities. But many white suffragists ignored the challenges that Black women faced and excluded Black women from their organizations. So Black reformers began organizing their own groups. And in 1896, when one of these groups was formed, Tubman served as a delegate to their first annual convention, and that was the first annual convention of the National Association of Colored Women. I'm going to switch us again to a new image. So in 1869, Tubman married a Union soldier. His name was Nelson Davis. He was also born into slavery, and he was actually about 22 years younger than she was. And in 1874, they adopted a daughter named Gertie. Now here I wanted to add in, there's some speculation that Tubman herself had a biological daughter. It appears pretty clear cut that Gertie was an adopted daughter, but the speculation likely derives from back in 1859 when Tubman returned from one of her rescue missions with a young girl named Margaret, who Tubman referred to as a niece, but also reported that Margaret was the daughter of a freed family that was living a stable life, and people questioned why Margaret would have been removed from that family. But also Margaret apparently resembled Tubman a great deal, and the two had a very strong bond. So that's what led to the speculation that Margaret was her daughter. But there really aren't records on this. We don't know her paternity. Really, most accounts report that Tubman never had any biological children. Okay, so getting back to her military service, although Tubman's service in the Union Army was highly publicized, she had great difficulty actually obtaining her pension from the government that she was owed. So after an extensive campaign, she was finally awarded first $8 per month in 1895, but she only got that for being Nelson Davis's widow for his service, and he had passed away 7 years earlier. But then in 1899, she did indeed get her pension, $20 per month for her own service. And Tubman, was very widely celebrated in her later years, but she did live in meager financial circumstances. So friends and benefactors tried to provide for her welfare, in large part by financing the publication of 2 biographies. They were written by Auburn teacher Sarah Bradford. They are Scenes in the Life of Harriet Tubman, published in 1868, and Harriet Tubman, The Moses of Her People, published in 1886. Now, Bradford, was undoubtedly a friend of Tubman's, an admirer, a fellow abolitionist. She had good intentions, but it was her work that created many of the fallacies and inconsistencies with the historical record that has unfortunately obscured much of the true nature of Tubman's work. In 1896, Tubman purchased 25 adjoining acres to her home in Auburn, on which they built what would become the Home for the Aged, a home for the elderly in the community. In 1903, she turned the property over to the AME Zion Church. She was struggling with the upkeep of it, and so the church would take it over. And actually, several years later, when Tubman's own health deteriorated, she was cared for at the Home for the Aged. Tubman died in 1913, and she was buried with military honors at Fort Hill Cemetery in Auburn, New York. Now going back to the exhibit. So Tubman's legacy still lives on. She's been honored with monuments and statues, and schools and roads across the country bear her name. Here we see Harriet Tubman Elementary School in Washington, D.C. She's also been featured on a U.S. postage stamp. And even more recently, she was the subject of a feature film entitled Harriet. It was released in 2019. I just want to touch on it briefly. I'd be happy to take questions on it too. But there are, with any piece of dramatized history, pros and cons. On the pro side, I would say we need more movies about women, about historical figures who are women, particularly women of color. So I personally was excited to learn about it for that reason. I think overall, the film does a good job telling the broad strokes of Tubman's life and her role in leading enslaved persons to freedom. It gets at some of the realities of enslaved and free life in a border state like Maryland. It shows how the enslaved resisted or coped under slavery, what the impact of the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850 was, the intricacies of the Underground Railroad and the network it took to sustain this clandestine action, as well as the psychic toll of enslavement and the dangers of running. And most importantly, it just really conveys Tubman's incredible spirit. But there are certainly critiques out there of the film. There are critiques of fictionalized characters who have been added to the narrative. There are critiques of the timeline. There are issues with what journeys took place when, and mostly with the Fugitive Slave Act itself, which the film depicts as happening, seemingly years after Tubman began her journeys into the South, not right at the beginning. The film really personifies the central conflict between Tubman and her former owner. And this is a fictionalized account, and I think it just diminishes Tubman's work in some ways. What she was doing was resisting an inhumane system, not just one evil man. But it is understandable why a narrative would try to personify the conflict in that way. As with any piece of dramatized history, I just encourage you to research the true story after you see it. Slate in particular has a good piece on fact versus fiction, and I included that in the list of resources to check out. So the other piece of contemporary news about Harriet Tubman that I want to discuss is her being put on the $20 bill. Now, the placement of her image on the $20 bill was first announced in 2016. She would replace Andrew Jackson, a slaveholder, on the face of the bill. But that implementation of that, it would take several years, was delayed until 2028 under the Trump administration. However, just recently under the Biden administration, they announced that they were taking steps to accelerate the release of the Tubman $20 bill. The design of it has not been released yet. Now, there are supporters who are heartened at the idea of an African-American woman being put in this place of honor on American currency, but there are also critics who believe it's wrong to put the likeness of a person who in her time was legally considered property, to put her likeness on tender that could have been used to buy or sell her. Zoe Samudzi, a feminist writer in Oakland, told the Washington Post, quote, "I'm mulling over the irony of a Black woman who was bought and sold being commemorated on the $20 bill without also taking steps for economic recompense for Black folks who are descendants of enslaved peoples, and I can't stop shaking my head," end quote. Feminista Jones, another social worker and feminist writer from New York City, also found it that it would undermine her legacy, which was rooted in resisting the foundation of American capitalism. Now, for another perspective, Professor Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, professor of history and African American studies at Harvard, saw the development as positive. She said, "Tubman wasn't against money. She spent it to pry others from slave owners. She used her money to go back into a place where she was a wanted woman. And it says something about how she thinks about money, that she used it as a way to help mankind." So we see there is debate about this move, but I am glad it's bringing attention to Tubman and her remarkable life. Oh, I'm sorry. So this is the end of the exhibit. I want to show, to close, this mural of Harriet Tubman. This mural debuted in 2019 at the Harriet Tubman Museum and Educational Center in Cambridge, Maryland. The painter, Michael Rosado, said he chose to depict the moment when she would reach out to a runaway slave, offering her hand to lead that man or woman to freedom. The mural, he said, would have to capture, quote, the compassion it would take to convince them to take the hand, as well as the look of authority so that they would take it. And to finally close this presentation, I want to show you a picture of this mural from social media that went viral soon after the mural was completed. So here, what we see is then 3-year-old Lovey Hope Duncan reaching out to high five Tubman. This picture was taken by Lovey's grandmother, Tracy Kilgore Lindy. And Tubman and Duncan connecting across the generations just seems like a fitting place to close. I don't think anything I can say can compare with this image. So with that, I will take your questions, and I will also just put in a quick plug for our event next week. If you enjoyed this presentation, a former fellow at the museum, Carrie Lee Alexander, will be doing another virtual walkthrough of an exhibit on Sojourner Truth next Sunday at 3 p.m. Eastern. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Mari, so much for walking us through that exhibit and giving us way more context than the exhibit is able to do. We do have some questions that have come in. I know that you spoke a little bit about the movie and kind of gave, kind of a warning label for the movie, kind of take some of it with a grain of salt. But one of the questions is about the movie. During the scene in the movie where she has the kind of confrontation with her former owner, and she has a vision in which she's predicting the coming of the Civil War. Since it is kind of known that she did experience kind of visions during her life, is there any record of whether or not she had this particular vision of the Civil War? Is there any documentation of that?
None that I found in my research. Certainly the visions, as I mentioned, she understood them as prophetic. So to think that some, were future oriented in this way, I think it's not a huge leap. And even there's one scene earlier in the movie where they're talking about the coming of Civil War. I think that just harkens to the amount of conflict was known at this time. The idea of slavery causing war between the states was within the realm of possibility. But I never saw anything about a specific vision that Tubman had herself. I think it was more something that people were thinking about, and it makes for a very compelling final scene there in the movie, certainly.
Absolutely. And again, with this exhibit, I mean, we know you were not the curator of this exhibit, and we don't know what was going on in the original curator's mind and why she chose the images that they chose while putting this together. But as somebody coming in and doing a presentation like this, how do you decide what additional information to add in and the additional photos? Do you know how many known photos there are of Harriet Tubman? How many were included in this exhibit?
I do not know a specific number. I think these are certainly the big hitters of images that we have of Tubman. I don't think there are many more. As I mentioned, one of the images I showed, it was uncovered in the call for items that the National Museum of African American History and Culture issued. And so that came to light after this exhibit was put together. So I think there's also room, the illustrations of her, they point to her legacy, how others understood her at different points later in time. So I think there's a lot of merit to including, this mural, other depictions of her. If it, me putting it together, I would say as many images that speak to a certain, say, time in her life or theme that she worked for, or just that was relevant to her story. But then otherwise, you also want to bring in context of what was going on at the time. What did the terrain look like where she was going on these missions? So there's reason to bring in all these other images as well. But yeah, I think these are some of the best and most evocative ones.
So, again, going back to a film, but in the movie Glory, there's a scene where the Kambahi ferry raid is kind of described with disgust, and it emphasizes the destruction and the pillaging of the mansions. Do you feel like that obscures the humanitarian achievement of the raid? Kind of looking at that description of it?
So first, full disclosure, I have not seen Glory. But just speaking off the context you've given me, I mean, I personally think even reading this, it's hard to see destruction being wrought. It's hard to hear about the warfare that was going on, to hear stories of, they destroyed food that they couldn't take with them. And the thought of that, when there's people going hungry, that's very difficult. I don't think it obscures the humanity. This was war. This is what happens during wartime. It's terrible, but it was in the service of a noble cause, I think. So it's complex. A lot of this history that's not just to obscure kind of the evilness of the institution of slavery and so much of this history, but there's good alongside destruction, and we just have to bear witness to all of it and prioritize the humanity of the individuals here. And I don't think destroying homes of slave owners obscures that. That's just not what is the most important thing here. This is a story about people fighting for themselves.
Absolutely. And kind of in this telling of her story, obviously we're not able to meet her, we're not able to talk to her and get her true voice and her thoughts on what happened in her life. But do you think that voice is important in telling other stories, especially this powerful one like Harriet Tubman's that has so many cultural undertones, implications, significances, and nuances? Is the voice, is that an important part of this?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think our work here broadly in the museum is about getting as many voices of women into the historical narrative as possible, because they're so often overlooked. And as you highlight these voices, you just learn so much of the detail and context and just who they were as people, what they were living through, what they were fighting for. And so the more people we can get to tell these stories too, they can bring their own voices into it and make those stories even stronger by telling about their connections to it, how their personal experience. So it absolutely matters. And there's just a variety of ways, I think, to incorporate them.
Yeah. And did she have, when we're talking, she's a conductor on the Underground Railroad, she's risking her life to bring other slaves to safety, to freedom. Kind of later in New York State, as this is going on, does she have freedom papers that prevent her from being captured and returned to the South? Or, was this just something where she just continually risked her life with the threat of possibly being captured and returned to slavery, kind of being held over her?
Mm-hmm. So I am not totally sure either way. I saw nothing in all my research that pointed to her having freedom papers. I am not sure how she would have obtained them, having, run away from her legal owner, her plantation. I can say that she was risking her freedom, her life every time she took one of these journeys. And I think what likely happened is, frankly, that when she was in places like New York before the Civil War, she was looked out for by her community, by the abolitionists she worked with. I do know, for example, it was the wife of then New York Senator Seward who sold her the property in Auburn. So there's some questions about how she could get that property. She had a mortgage drawn up, but it was allies who were assisting her, and I think keeping an eye out. And so I think it was, she did amazing things on her own, but she also relied on a network to help her. And so that's my thought.
Yeah. Kind of jumping forward into more of the modern debate that we're having right now with the idea of Harriet Tubman being on the $20 bill. What kind of is your opinion about the argument that is currently happening about with replacing Andrew Jackson with Harriet Tubman? Do you think, that there's so many different camps that people currently sit in? What is your opinion about it? Is it an erasure of the history associated with the life and the career? Kind of, what are your thoughts as you were doing research and just kind of listening to news as it's coming up on the topic?
I had been aware for years of the Tubman $20 bill issue. I hadn't been aware of this debate until more recently, and I really appreciated learning about it. I absolutely respect both sides. I think it's a very good debate to be having. Personally, the first kind of easiest thing to say is I've read that one design of the $20 bill also featured a statue of Andrew Jackson on the back of the $20 bill. And I feel very comfortable saying no to that, no to having Jackson anywhere on the same bill as Tubman. That is deplorable, in my opinion. Otherwise, I think I fall on the side of supporting having her on the bill. I think there is a lot of kind of conceptual and rhetorical power, particularly for the younger generations, of seeing women of color in places of honor like this. And the ways in which racism and slavery were and are embedded into the capitalist system, it's deeply intertwined and very complex stuff. But I think that in the meantime, there's still something to be gained by putting her in this place of honor. And I hope that it would encourage more people to simply learn about who's this new person on the $20 bill, why are they there, what's their story. But again, I do have respect for the other side of it. It's a very valid point, in my opinion.
And we have kind of a few questions that have come in, wondering about what happened to Harriet Tubman's adopted daughter. What about the medal that Queen Victoria gave to her? Whether or not Minty, that the nickname that was given to her, whether or not it was derogatory or if it was just the name that her family used to call her, since her name was Araminta, which kind of seems like a pretty easy nickname to fall into with a name like that. Do you have kind of any information? I know it's kind of hard to come up with some of this information, but do we know what happened to her adopted daughter, or the medal that was given to her, or any of this kind of more personal information?
So going through quickly, I really don't have any information, I'm sorry to say, about the medal from Queen Victoria. I didn't come across that in my research, but perhaps it's in some of the resources I recommended. Second, what happened to Gertie? Frankly, I don't know. And I did specifically try to find this out beforehand. I was very curious, descendants of such an amazing figure, you want to know what their lives were like. And I'm sure there's something out there I haven't found, but the things I did find were other people saying they hadn't been able to find information on. Her name would have been Gertie Davis, I think, perhaps Gertie Tubman Davis, but probably just Gertie Davis. So I really don't know. I would love to find out myself. And then third, about her name, yes. So I can tell you in the film, they do present it as that she takes Harriet as a freedom name after she gets to Philadelphia, but actually more accounts think that she took it in 1844 when she got married or around that time. So the film portrays it as a derogatory name that her the people who enslaved her would call her. But other accounts seem to purport that it was simply the nickname that her family called her. So I can't be sure, but I'm inclined to think she just chose the name Harriet and then went from there.
Yeah. So we have time just for one final question, and I apologize. We've gotten many questions that have come in. I apologize that we can't get to all of them today. But as a final question, before leaving everybody, what are your takeaways from, again, this is not the exhibit that you put together, but in your research and learning more about her, and doing this presentation today, what are your takeaways from Harriet Tubman and the work that she did and her legacy today? What would you like to leave us with as we move on in our afternoon?
I mean, it's somewhat what I was saying at the beginning. Just I was just astounded by her dedication, her determination to go back 13 times into Maryland to get her family, her friends, members of her community. When she was doing this, when everyone around her was saying it's too dangerous, don't. She was extraordinary in that regard. And then that, a takeaway is even the movie does this. The movie really focuses on about 10 years of her life. There's so much more to her life. And this happens with a lot of historical figures who, Rosa Parks, for example, gets known for the bus boycott when she had a long legacy of advocacy work. To learn more about the rest of of their lives and all the other work they were doing. And you see how sometimes it was these dangerous spy missions, and sometimes it was baking and selling pies to raise money, but that's what needed to be done, and she did it. So to learn that whole story, and then I think there's just something really interesting in how her story has changed over time. This happens with a lot of figures. I think it tends to get to be a little more condoned or allowed with, say, a white male historical figure. But she was essentially managing her brand and putting out these biographies and telling her story. Other people were attempting to do the same. Even if they were inflating her stories, these abolitionists were doing it for a cause she believed in, in an attempt to overthrow slavery. So learning why we have these varied accounts of her life and her work can tell us a lot about their goals, their methods, just what was happening at the time.
Well, thank you again so much for being with us today, sharing the powerful story about this very inspirational woman and your thoughts and insights as well. Just a reminder to everybody, we have recorded this presentation today. It will be available on our website, hopefully sometime this week. It will be on womenshistory.org under our Sundays at Home page on the website. If you did enjoy this program today, please join us next Sunday, February 28th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time for another curator-led virtual walkthrough of the museum's popular online exhibit Sojourner Truth with Carrie Lee Alexander, curator of the Sojourner Truth exhibit and former Education and Public History Fellow at the National Women's History Museum. Again, all of these events are free. Advanced registration is required. For more details and registration information for this event and any other event that we have going on at the National Women's History Museum, please visit womenshistory.org. Mariana, I want to thank you again so much for taking the time to put this presentation together today, and for answering all of those questions so beautifully. Thank you to all of our attendees for being with us and for all of your fantastic questions. I hope that you have a wonderful Sunday. Stay warm, stay safe, stay healthy, and we certainly hope to see you again at another time for another program.